Why are we in a universe where everything has to eat something else in order to survive?
For over 25 years, investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe kept an Antarctica file that she refused to open publicly. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the people inside it were still alive, and exposing them could have destroyed their lives. Navy flight engineers, NORAD officers, radar specialists, military contractors, all describing the same thing from completely separate corners of the classified world. Enormous artificial structures buried miles beneath Antarctic ice, built by something that shouldn't exist.
Mainstream geologists have long believed that ancient humans never settled on Antarctica because of its hostile climate. But incredibly, satellite images revealed a curious formation emerging from the ice.
Thousands of years before recorded civilization began. Now, one by one, those witnesses have started dying. And Howe, at 81 years old, has decided that silence is no longer protection. It's erasure. What she's finally admitted they saw beneath that ice isn't just unexplained, it's terrifying. And once you hear what these men described, you'll understand why it was kept secret for so long. The woman behind the file. Linda Moulton. Howe didn't build her reputation on speculation. In the 1970s, she was a television producer and director in Denver, running hard investigations into water contamination and radiation hazards. The kind of journalism where every claim needs documents and every source needs verification. That discipline never left her. Every witness she ever spoke to was checked against records. Every timeline had to hold up under pressure. In 1979, Colorado ranchers and veterinarians pulled her toward a string of disturbingly precise cattle mutilations. She treated it like any other case. Field interviews first, conventional explanations first. The result was A Strange Harvest, a documentary that earned a regional Emmy in 1981. That recognition opened an unexpected door. Once you become the person willing to listen carefully and ask uncomfortable questions, people who've been sitting on dangerous secrets start testing whether you're worth the risk. Over the following years, the people reaching out to her changed. It wasn't just civilians anymore. Retired military personnel, intelligence officers, and contractors who'd touched classified logistics systems most people don't know exist. They started calling. And there was a consistent pattern to when these people came forward. It wasn't during their careers, it was after retirement, after illness. Late in life, when the professional leverage that keeps people silent starts losing its teeth. When they spoke, Howe says they were unusually precise. Job titles, procedures, operational constraints, delivered without theatrics. The way trained professionals report facts, not perform stories. This is how Antarctica entered her world. Not as a single dramatic disclosure, but as a file that built itself slowly over years. Pilots referenced restricted airspace over the continent. Engineers described assignments they were told never to discuss. Contractors recalled rules that didn't match any known public science mission. And the warnings she received weren't theatrical. They came as calm, procedural boundaries. The kind that arrive with security clearances, government contracts, and non-disclosure agreements. Plus the unspoken understanding that careers and families can be quietly destroyed without anyone ever issuing a direct threat. That created a dilemma she carried for decades. Publish everything with names and specifics, and she risked destroying people still bound by legal agreements. Publish nothing, and the story dies in private conversations. She chose restraint, not to bury the material, but to keep channels open, protect sources, and keep collecting until the record could be placed on the table responsibly. But here's the deal. If this kind of content keeps you watching, hit subscribe now. Because what comes next changes everything you think you know about Antarctica. The First Witness. Antarctica's first testimony arrived in 1998 with a phone call from a retired United States Navy flight engineer who had served during Operation Deep Freeze, the long-running military logistics operation supporting Antarctic missions. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. He was in declining health, and he told Howe he refused to die with this still locked inside him. His story went back to 1982. He'd been assigned to a supply flight out of McMurdo Station when a mechanical failure forced an unscheduled landing on a remote ridge far short of their destination. While the crew waited for repairs, they spotted something on a nearby ridgeline that didn't belong. angular forms jutting from the ice, not geological, not natural. Part of a massive structure appeared to be protruding through the surface, composed of material that wasn't snow, wasn't exposed rock, and wasn't anything any of them could identify from a distance. Now, pay attention to this part. Before anyone could get closer, direct orders came. Abandon the site, return to McMurdo immediately. No discussion. When they landed, they weren't sent to their quarters. Intelligence officers were waiting. Flight records were confiscated. The entire incident was reclassified. Every crew member signed additional non-disclosure agreements. The engineer told Howe the whole exchange was calm and bureaucratic. No raised voices, no threats. Just a clean, procedural wall of silence. And the unspoken understanding that asking questions would end careers and reach families. He carried that for 16 years before calling Howe. She interviewed him multiple times, verified his service record, confirmed his role in Antarctic operations, and cross-referenced every detail of his timeline against publicly known logistics procedures. Specific dates, routes, weather conditions, command structures, everything aligned, but she didn't publish it. By her own standards, a single witness wasn't enough to justify a public claim that would challenge accepted narratives about Antarctica. So she archived the account and waited. And then other people started calling. The pattern of unrelated sources began reaching out with overlapping references, restricted zones, unusual operational rules, assignments that didn't match any public description of scientific work on the continent. None of them repeated the engineer's story directly, but the themes converged on the same continent, the same silence, and the same machinery of suppression. Here's the catch. These weren't random people telling random stories. They came from completely separate professions, and the patterns they described were disturbingly consistent. A geophysicist told Howe he had personally reviewed ice-penetrating radar and seismic survey data that revealed enormous voids beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. These weren't subglacial lakes or volcanic cavities. The shapes were geometric, regular in outline, and symmetrical in ways that natural geology simply doesn't produce. When he flagged the data and submitted it for review, the reaction was immediate. The project was reassigned. The results were classified. His entire team lost access overnight. No explanation was offered. He told Howe he never forgot the look on his supervisor's face when the data first came in. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. And get this, a completely separate source described what may have been the other end of the same operation. A member of a naval construction battalion, a CB, told Howe he'd been deployed to a remote site far from any publicly acknowledged research station. The drilling coordinates were predetermined. This wasn't exploration. Someone already knew exactly where to dig. When the drill reached its target depth, he observed exposed surfaces that weren't ice and weren't stone. Smooth, metallic. He described running his gloved hand across something that felt like aircraft fuselage, except it was buried under miles of ancient ice. Within hours, his team was pulled out and replaced by personnel with higher security clearance, more NDAs, zero explanation. He told Howe about it decades later, speaking in a low, measured voice, pausing between sentences like a man still checking over his shoulder. Then there was the civilian researcher. A scientist affiliated with Argentina's Esperanza base told Howe that unusual objects would occasionally surface in deep ice layers during routine field work. Not fossils, not mineral deposits, objects. And every single time, military personnel arrived and seized them immediately. No documentation was left with the research team. Nothing entered any academic reporting channel. The scientist didn't speculate about what the objects were. He only marveled at the speed and consistency of the response, every time, without exception. As if someone was watching and waiting for exactly this. Here's where it gets terrifying. A pilot who flew repeated Antarctic supply routes described entire regions of permanent restricted airspace that appeared on no standard civilian navigation chart. When he requested clarification, he was told the areas were sensitive and unrelated to his assignment. End of discussion. The restrictions were enforced with complete procedural normalcy, as though blocking access to vast sections of an entire continent was simply routine. None of these people knew each other. The radar specialist saw anomalous data. The CB touched metallic surfaces miles underground. The scientist watched objects get confiscated. The pilot flew around airspace that officially didn't exist. Each one only saw what their role permitted, but Howe, collecting these case files over years, saw the mosaic, and every new piece pointed to coordinated, multinational, classified activity beneath Antarctic ice, sustained across decades and hidden behind layers of bureaucratic silence. She had more than a dozen testimonies, and then, in 2016, someone called who connected all of them. The briefing that changed everything. The man who contacted Howe in 2016 was a retired officer from NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Unlike every previous source, he wasn't bringing a single incident or a narrow observation. He was bringing the overview, access to classified briefings that synthesized multiple Antarctic operations spanning decades and nations. Howe says she treated him with more caution than any source before, delaying documentation for months while verifying his service history, rank, and operational clearance down to the smallest detail. What he described rearranged her understanding of every testimony she had ever collected. The briefings, he said, focused on structures beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, not at dozens of feet, but at depths measured in miles. These structures were assessed as artificial in origin and dated to a period before the last major glaciation, more than 12,000 years ago. The dating was based on ice stratification and geological modeling. Let that sink in. These structures were built when Antarctica wasn't buried under permanent ice, when it was a habitable continent. And it wasn't a single site. The briefings described multiple locations, characterized not as isolated ruins, but as an extensive built environment. The officer connected these findings to classified components of Operation High Jump, the massive 1946-47 Navy expedition led by Admiral Richard Byrd. While High Jump was publicly framed as a training mission, classified objectives included seismic and mapping work that first detected anomalies beneath the ice. Those early findings, he said, didn't trigger excavation. They triggered decades of quiet, continuous monitoring. Multiple governments were aware. The United States and Russia were described as early participants, with China joining later as its Antarctic presence expanded. Access to certain sites was achieved through drilling operations officially labeled scientific research, while other entry points became reachable through natural ice movement over time. Recovered materials were transported off the continent to classified facilities for analysis. But here's what shook Howe most. The officer said some of the recovered technology was not degraded. It was intact, functional enough to warrant active study, not just cataloging. He didn't claim to understand how any of it worked. He only said it didn't match any known manufacturing method or historical timeline, not by centuries, by millennia. Howe pressed hard for corroboration. The officer provided coordinates, partially redacted documents tied to classified projects at those locations, and names of personnel involved. Over subsequent years, she tracked down some of those names. A few refused to speak. Others confirmed limited details without elaboration. And some, nearing the end of their lives, knowing silence no longer protected anyone, chose to talk. Evidence without a photograph. Now here's where this whole thing gets even more unsettling. By the time Howe had assembled more than a dozen first-hand testimonies, she also started receiving accounts from people who didn't witness structures or objects directly, but who handled the evidence chain around them, and their descriptions painted a picture of deliberate, systematic concealment that went far beyond standard military secrecy. A former satellite imagery analyst told Howe that certain Antarctic regions were treated differently during data processing, and not in the way you'd expect. Public-facing satellite images of those areas weren't simply low resolution. They were deliberately altered. Sections appeared blurred, flattened, or masked in ways that didn't match normal degradation or compression artifacts. He described seeing the higher resolution versions before they were scrubbed for public release. And in those originals, rectilinear forms were visible. Straight edges, right angles, shapes inconsistent with any natural terrain on Earth. He didn't claim the images proved construction, but he told Howe the processing was intentional, targeted to specific coordinates, and restricted to personnel with the highest clearance levels. He said the thing that stayed with him wasn't what he saw in the images. It was how calmly everyone around him treated the alterations, as though erasing evidence of impossible structures was just another Tuesday at the office. And get this, the suppression wasn't limited to imagery. A logistics coordinator working within the United States Antarctic program overseen by the National Science Foundation, described shipment manifests that made no sense for civilian research operations. Industrial-scale drilling equipment, sealed transport containers with no listed contents, cargo escorted not by research staff, but by Department of Defense personnel. When she asked for clarification on where these shipments were going and what they contained, she was told flatly that they fell outside civilian oversight. They were not to be logged, not to be questioned, not to be mentioned. Think about that for a moment. A civilian program funded by taxpayers, operating on a continent governed by international treaty, running shipments that civilian administrators were explicitly forbidden from documenting. That's not standard procedure. That's a parallel operation hiding inside a public one. But here's the detail that might be the most striking of all. A materials scientist told Howe he had been contracted to analyze samples labeled only as Antarctic recovery. No site coordinates, no context, no origin story. Just the material and a set of instructions. Document composition and performance characteristics only. Do not investigate origin. Do not estimate age. The material, he said, was metallic, but it didn't behave like any known alloy. The strength-to-weight ratio was unlike anything in existing engineering databases. Its resistance to corrosion exceeded every conventional expectation by a wide margin. He described running test after test, recalibrating his instruments because he kept assuming the readings were errors. They weren't. After submitting his report, he was paid, required to sign additional confidentiality agreements, and dismissed from the project without follow-up. No one told him what he'd analyzed, no one told him where it came from, and no one ever contacted him about the results. He told Howe the silence afterward was more disturbing than the material itself, because it meant whoever commissioned the analysis already knew what they had. They weren't looking for answers, they were looking for confirmation. Now, pay attention to this pattern. None of these people, the imagery analyst, the logistics coordinator, the materials scientist, offered physical proof they could share. No raw images, no unredacted manifests, no samples. What they provided instead were professional details that could be cross-checked. Job titles, agencies, contract dates, internal procedures. Howe verified as much as she could without exposing identities. And in her framing, the absence of public evidence wasn't accidental. It was the product of compartmentalization, designed from the ground up to ensure that no single person ever held enough pieces to see the full picture. Each witness saw only what their clearance level and job function permitted. The imagery analyst saw altered photographs. The coordinator saw unexplained shipments. The scientist saw impossible materials. But none of them were ever allowed to connect those dots. And that, according to Howe, is exactly how the system was built to work. The dying record. The Navy flight engineer, who first called Howe in 1998, died in 2019. The NORAD officer passed away in 2022. Others followed, some after long illness, some quietly, leaving behind families who never knew what they carried. With every death, the equation changed. When these men were alive, Howe's priority was protection. Names stayed sealed, details stayed compartmented. Once they were gone, silence no longer shielded anyone. It only erased what they had witnessed. Testimony left unpublished doesn't wait patiently. It dissolves. Notes without living witnesses. Claims without verifiable timelines. Memories without anchors. By 2020, Howe had documented more than 15 credible testimonies tied to Antarctica. Restricted zones, targeted drilling, data suppression, material confiscation, altered satellite imagery, and unexplained logistics. When she began releasing portions through her Earth Files platform, the response from every referenced government and agency was identical. Absolute silence. No rebuttals, no corrections, no legal action, nothing. And here's the thing, that silence says more than most people realize. If these claims were fabricated, a simple denial would discredit them overnight. If the witnesses were lying, releasing their actual service records would end the conversation. But nothing came. No response at all. Howe doesn't treat that silence as confirmation, but she documents it as a response. Because refusing to address specific claims tied to specific coordinates from sources with verified military backgrounds is itself a choice. And it's the same choice these institutions have been making for over 70 years. In late 2023, at 81 years old, Howe began assembling what she described as a complete Antarctica archive. transcripts with identifying information removed, cross-reference timelines, geographic coordinates appearing independently across multiple accounts, and references to classified operations spanning half a century. She released portions in early 2024, not as a verdict, not as a grand reveal, as a record placed into the open while there was still time by the last person alive who had spoken to most of these witnesses directly. She knew the criticism would come. Testimony without physical evidence doesn't overturn established history. Howe has never disputed that boundary. She draws a clear line between what witnesses told her, what she could verify administratively, and what remains unproven. Her work doesn't declare discovery. It catalogs statements from people with documented access, professional training, and real personal risk. And supporters of her work argue something narrower than proof. They point to consistency. Consistency across decades, professions, security clearances, and national programs. And they argue that kind of alignment deserves serious examination rather than reflexive dismissal. At 81, Howe has described this as the last major investigation she expects to complete. Everything she built before, environmental reporting, classified military testimony, decades of source development, shaped how she handled this material. Antarctica, in her account, is not a symbol or a metaphor. It is a regulated continent with restricted access, where multiple witnesses with verifiable credentials say something exists beneath the ice that does not fit accepted timelines of human civilization. Linda Moulton. Howe isn't asking you to believe her. She's asking you to look at what 15 military and scientific professionals described independently across decades, and ask why every single one of them was silenced. Structures miles beneath the ice, technology predating known civilization, satellite imagery deliberately altered, materials that defy modern engineering, a cover-up spanning multiple governments and more than 70 years, and a journalist who waited until her sources were gone to finally put it all on record. So here's the question. If there's nothing under Antarctica, why is it the most restricted, most surveilled, most classified continent on Earth? And why has no government on the planet ever directly addressed these claims? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit like if this one kept you watching, and subscribe, because this file is far from closed.